Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here tonight because I feel super passionate about what I'm going to share with you, which is a way for us to expand our trauma awareness when we are thinking about or interacting with people in dire circumstances, particularly homelessness. And I want to start out with a story that I think is really symbolic of why I feel so passionately about my work. Last, June, I was speaking in New York about collapse and emergence, and most of all, what I think trauma awareness honors, which is our inner strength as human beings, no matter where we are or under what circumstances. And I got a standing ovation, and that was great. And afterwards, I went to lunch with a colleague, and we had pizza in Washington Square Park in New York City. And as we were eating and talking, I couldn't help but notice that we were surrounded by unsheltered people. And the scene was actually quite ugly and disturbing. There was one man who vomited into the bushes. There were several people who were sitting around in various states of disrepair, and it was upsetting. And the thought did enter my mind, like, who am I to be saying that our internal strength and that alignment with our internal strength via resources that bolster our internal strength, which is what trauma awareness is all about? Who am I to say that this is what is one of the biggest overlooked answers to homelessness? And then, I thought, well, who am I not to believe in this? Because just 7 years ago, I was unhoused and I was lying naked on the streets of Salt Lake City in a gutter. And that juxtaposition is so stark, right? Like, now I'm a trauma-aware journalist who is thriving and who is writing and who loves her life. And so that's what I'm coming to you with, is that kind of transformation that happened to me because of trauma awareness. So, of course, even though I was a journalist at the Miami Herald, as well as before that, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and before that, the Syracuse newspapers, it was never in my mind that I was going to be a trauma-aware journalist. At the Miami Herald, I wrote about people who were severely marginalized, whether individually or as a collective. And I've always been drawn to that work. But trauma-aware journalist, that thought never entered my mind. So it's really clear that life molded me and actually forced me to be who I am today. And I say forced because without the awareness that I have, that I had to have, I believe that I would have died. Or at the very least, be forever under the auspices of, severely damaged. So a little bit about, who I am and this life molding from which I speak. But as I talk about it, I really want to emphasize that I don't believe that my lived experience is necessary to be trauma aware. In fact, I believe that by sharing my life experience through journalism, and the fact that I have journalism to share it in that kind of platform, will help people avoid having to have the kind of experiences that I had. So way back, I grew up in Palo Alto, California, and I grew up in the privileged part of Palo Alto. My father was a scientist at NASA Ames Research Center and eventually went on to work on the space shuttle. My mom was a secretary at Stanford University and then became the CEO of a nonprofit. So in many ways, though not all, I lived a rather idyllic life for quite some time. I went to one of the best high schools at the time in the nation. I was supported in my talents. I was nurtured by my parents. I took piano lessons, and when I showed talent, they bought me a baby grand piano, and I practiced on that for hours every day. And then when I decided, the way children tend to do, like, oh, well, I want to do this now. And I said, I want to be a ballerina. My mom had taken me to the Nutcracker at the War Memorial Opera House. And I said, that's what I want to do. And so they allowed me to enroll in ballet school. And I went on to dance with the San Francisco Ballet for many years and study with them as a student and even perform in the Nutcracker that I had seen that had so inspired me. And that was lovely. And then I went to San Francisco State University, where I graduated with honors. I went on to become a journalist. And my first job was in Syracuse newspapers, and then St. Louis, and then the Miami Herald, where I worked my way up from a micro news reporter into the position of an enterprise reporter, which position because you're allowed to basically find stories on your own and work with a lot of independence. And that was a great job. And then in 2000, my father died, and I decided to step back from journalism and take a break. And for a while, I started a nonprofit helping inner city school children perform and write their life stories. I worked really hard, and then I moved to Southern Oregon and bought a very small horse ranch, 2.5 acres in Grants Pass, Oregon, and started my own business to support my 2 beautiful Arabian horses. And so in that, once again, life was rather idyllic for me, though I worked really hard. I had that business for 10 years. And then what I call the great tsunami of trauma swept through my life and took everything and everyone with it in a very short period of time. This was between 2013 and 2014. And it started out with a fire that destroyed the home where I was living, as well as all my possessions. The only thing that I had left once that fire stopped burning were the clothes on my back and my animals. And this is really important. During that fire, unbeknownst to me, I subjected myself to post-traumatic stress. And how that happened was when the fire was in a huge blaze, I ran into it my landlord, who was standing frozen in front of the kitchen sink. The fire had started because of faulty wiring in that wall where the sink was. And I ran in and I pulled her out, and she survived, and it seemed that all was well, but I didn't know that putting my life in danger would induce like post-traumatic stress. Then within weeks of that occurrence, my mom was diagnosed with a terminal disease, and I watched her wither away. And that was also something that caused or deepened the post-traumatic stress that I didn't know I had, that no one knew I had. And while that was happening, my dog, my beloved beagle, Luna, was diagnosed with the terminal disease and began to die. And while that was happening, in the greater context of it, there was a lot of dysfunctional fighting over the very small amount of money that my mother had. And the safety net that is a family completely broke away. And when my mom died, that side of my family I was no longer connected to. One thing I should say is my father was a first-generation immigrant from Panama, and his family members, many of them were far-flung. They were either living in Panama or in different states around the country, and I had maybe met them once. So I didn't have a close-knit connection to my family. So I moved into a customer of mine from the horse treat business that I mentioned, moved into her house with my animals because where I was living while my mom was dying, the state owned her home. So, excuse me, I couldn't stay there. And I should also say that I had lost my ranch in a foreclosure in the Great Recession, along with millions of other people. So I went to go live with this customer and was really shutting down emotionally because of all the stress that I had gone through, which included working in my business for 8 years without a day off. So I didn't have a lot of emotional reserves. And as I've pointed out, I didn't have much of a safety net around me financially because of the fire, emotionally because of the death, or psychologically because of all the stresses. So for me, what that looked like was curling up in a ball in my bedroom in the house of this new landlord for most of the day. And it was really clear that I wasn't coping well with running my business, which I tried to sell. I also sent out some resumes, but did not hear back. And in the incapability that I was displaying to pay the rent, my landlord threatened me with eviction, and she didn't end up filing for eviction, but the threat was made. And so it was really clear I had to leave. And while in that shock, I didn't have a place to take my horses to. And so I signed over their care to her. And in 2014, left the premises with nothing. Well, so essentially became homeless. And that was on the day that I buried my dog and said goodbye to my horses. So huge amount of shock and stress going on there, and as well as the PTSD. So, excuse me, just to get a little sip of water. Okay, thank you. So from there, the couch surfing went on for, I think, about 6 months. And I ended up in a spiritual ashram in Utah. And I volunteered there for a couple of months, but was told at the end of my stay that I wasn't following the guidance of the Holy Spirit in the way that they thought I should, meaning that I wasn't talking as much as they thought I should and wasn't producing the kind of work that they wanted. And they drove me to a hotel in Salt Lake City, dropped me off, and 48 hours later, the police came because I wasn't able to pay my bill and drove me directly to the entryway of the road home, which was Salt Lake City's biggest homeless shelter. And I just want to reiterate here the shock that I was in, having just months earlier been on a 100-acre horse ranch with my horses, taking baths in a clawfoot tub, running a business. No thought of this kind of stress, of the ability of it to harm me or impair me in the ways that it had. And then suddenly landing in front of this homeless shelter and seeing people strung out on drugs, lying in the streets, smelling the smell of drugs I'd never smelled before, listening to people screaming, watching people fight, going into the homeless shelter, being given a cot because there were no available beds in a 24-hour-a-day fluorescent lit hallway where you would try to sleep, but you couldn't sleep because people were coming in and calling, and it was absolutely impossible to sleep. And then in like the first 2 weeks of my state of homelessness, I went across the street to the homeless outreach center where I got my daily hygiene kits. And a man who worked at that homeless outreach center targeted me, stalked me, meaning began to meet me at the entryway of the homeless shelter every day and follow me to the library where I spent my time during the day, and then followed me back. So he was stalking me, but I wasn't aware that he was stalking me because, remember, I am this person from a very protected environment. I don't have any street smarts. I'm in shock, and he's buying me food, and I think that he's trying to befriend me. But eventually and very quickly, the stalking turned into him abducting me into a storage unit under the guise of giving me a duffel bag to store my clothes in, because my clothes were tumbling out of the leather satchel that my mother had given me before she passed. And when I went into the storage shed, he sexually assaulted me. And when I came out of the storage shed a couple of days later, I was unable to track time. I completely stopped talking in my trauma. And I entered a state called freeze, which is what happens when people can't flee or fight. So for me, freeze was a very deep state of inner quietness, head down. And this abuse continued for a solid year and was it was repeated numerous times. And then after a year, I was incarcerated and or institutionalized because I had started after the repeated sexual abuse to lie naked in the streets of Salt Lake City. So I went further inward in that incarceration and institutionalization, where I was deemed never to be able to take care of myself again if I lived. And somehow in April of 2016, I was lying on a park bench, because what would happen was when the jails were full, they would put me in the psych ward. When the psych wards were full, they would put me in the jail. It was a very traumatizing experience. And when I was released, I would just walk back to the park bench. And sometimes the man who had accosted me would meet me outside the doors of the jailhouse and follow me to the park bench. But that's another story. But while all this was going on, I finally, lying on the park bench one day, decided that I was going to die, or the awareness came to me that I was going to die if I didn't do something different. So I walked back to the homeless outreach center that day, where I had previously been accosted. And though I was terrified to do so, the nudge was to go there and to try to get help. And then in a series of serendipitous events, I was taken to a church where the pastor introduced me to a nonprofit leader who then gave me my first home out of homelessness. And within 3 days of leaving the park bench and going back into the city, I was housed. And within a week, this still flabbergasts me to say, because it was really quite miraculous. Within a week, I wrote a story for a paper that served, handed out by the unhoused to people on the street. It was called the Street News, and it's now defunct. But at the time, I wrote a story about mothers on Mother's Day, and I had lost my access to contacts or glasses during my homelessness. So, and I'm almost legally blind in the right eye, severe astigmatism and nearsightedness. And without even really being able to see the people I was interviewing, I wrote down these notes in a story, like peering up really close to them, took a bunch of notes, and somehow produced a story that then paid for my contacts, $200. Like, the church exchanged my work for the contacts. And then from there, I began writing more stories, and I got a job as a grocery store clerk, and then as a grant writer. And then I wrote a piece for the Washington Post through an editor who had once been my editor at the Miami Herald. And I got that story. It ran on the front page. It was quite a big deal for me, because then it opened the doors for me to become a writer for the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. And that was the start of really my full-fledged career back in journalism. And that was almost 7 years ago. So here I am, today, a trauma-aware journalist for the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, where I have worked my way up from a contributor to a fellow to a team member. And every year that I work, my definition of what it means to be a trauma-aware journalist expands. And so it no longer means for me, for example, that to be trauma aware is simply to be aware of another person's trauma. It means a lot more to that. it means, yes, an awareness that someone, definitely an awareness that someone has or is going through trauma, but it also means respect for the resiliency of their ability to survive that trauma and that pain, whether they've overcome it or are currently going through it. And it also means acknowledging the societal forces that either perpetuate or keep that trauma in place. And it means understanding the brain's innate responses to trauma. So the flight, the fight, and the freeze mode. It means, an awareness of what's going on in the reptilian brain, what's going on in the frontal cortex, and how when the reptilian brain is repeatedly go into firing mode to keep you alive, then other parts of the brain go passive and even diminish in size. And it also, this is just as important as everything else, it means a recognition of neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to heal from trauma. So why are these things so critical for a journalist to understand and to parlay to her audience? So I'm going to take them one at a time. So understanding pain and trauma, in the case of homelessness, as basic as this sounds, and I think we have a pretty well-informed audience here from what Randall was telling me, but a lot of people don't understand that homelessness is trauma. And when you don't acknowledge that, for example, homelessness is trauma, that living without a roof over your head, that living without a toilet, living without access to clean water and food and a place to wash yourself, when you don't take into account that those things are traumatic, you fall into the thought constructs that the world gives out about the unhoused, which are not trauma aware. And I know you've all heard of these crazy, lazy, and drug addicted. Those are the three main stereotypes that we tend to project onto people when we don't have an awareness of their trauma, which starts with just understanding the hell that they are living in or have lived through. And in terms of interviewing someone in that kind of pain or who has just recently overcome that pain, which I often do, as a journalist, I have to take into account that they're in a state of hypervigilance. And in that state of hypervigilance, which is something they can't control, it's actually their brain keeping them safe. They may not and are very likely to distrust me, or they may flood me with information, which is something super common to people who haven't had the safety zone to inhabit in order to process their trauma. So if I ask a question and I get a 15-minute answer, I need to allow for that and then gently maybe focus the person on a question that is part of my agenda, but may not be part of their agenda. Or maybe I need to drop the agenda and listen to what is being said. I think that's really important in a field and in a world where we're constantly under the stress of production and time, and we got to get this done, and this is when we need to get it done, and this is what I think it needs to look like. Trauma awareness, true trauma awareness, takes away that kind of agenda and widens itself to the needs of the people in front of me. So also, without the acknowledgement of trauma, we cannot recognize its coping mechanisms. And that's really what flight, fight, and freeze are. They're coping mechanisms. They're not frailties. And I think that's how we've been conditioned as a collective to look at them. Oh, that person has PTSD. Oh, that person has CPTSD. Oh, that person is, unable to cope. And so we pathologize these responses, which is actually the person's way of surviving something that is, in many cases, not survivable. Okay, so in his seminal book, Besser van der Kolk, I'm sure you guys have heard of this book, The Body Keeps the Score. Besser van der Kolk says, quote, "We are a hopeful species. Working with trauma is as much about remembering how we survived as it is about what is broken." And I also, there's this fantastic book called My Grandmother's Hands, because I want to share this quote with you, because I find that when I start talking to people on the street about not people in trauma, but just anybody a layman, about trauma and the way the brain works and reconfigures itself to stay alive, keep the body alive, people's eyes kind of glaze over and they're like, yeah, and I'm like, it's hard for me to get across to them what is going on inside the body. And I feel that this quote by Resmaa Menakem, a therapist in the Bronx, a Black therapist, in his book called My Grandmother's Hands, kind of slows it down and helps me understand what's going on inside the body. And so I just want to share that quote. Our bodies have a form of knowledge that is different from our cognitive brains. That knowledge is typically experienced as a felt sense of constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. Often this knowledge is stored in our bodies as a wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. The body is where we fear, hope, and react, where we constrict and release, and where we reflexively fight, flee, or freeze. If we are to upend the status quo, now advances in psychology reveal that our deepest emotions, love, fear, anger, dread, grief, sorrow, disgust, and hope, involve the activation of our bodily structures. These structures, a complex system of nerves, connect the brainstem, pharynx, heart, lungs, stomach, gut, and spine. Neuroscientists call this system the wandering nerve or our vagus nerve. A more apt name might be our soul nerve. The soul nerve is connected directly to a part of our brain that doesn't use cognition or reasoning as its primary tool for navigating the world. Our soul nerve also helps mediate between our body's activating energy and resting energy. This part of our brain is similar to the brains of lizards, birds, and lower mammals. Our lizard brain only understands survival and protection. At any given moment, it can issue one of a handful of survival commands: rest, fight, flee, or freeze. These are the only commands it knows and the only choices it is able to make. And when it makes these commands, it literally can hijack the brain. So to blame and shame somebody who is instilling a survival mechanism to walk through the hell of something like homelessness and is then having to endure our projections about them as being lesser than because of their attempt to survive. Seen in that context, I think it's really helpful in giving us a deep sense of trauma awareness. And next, there's the context that I mentioned that is imperative for a trauma-aware journalist to have. And I'll go through this because we're getting close on time, but in the order of the stereotypes that we often employ about the unhoused. So, for example, homeless people are criminals. That's a stereotype that we often just instinctively fall into or brace ourselves against when we see an unhoused person. So when put into this kind of context that I'm about to share with you, it takes on a new angle, right? So according to the Vera Institute of Justice, an independent nonprofit national research and policy organization, people experiencing homelessness are up to 11 times more likely to be arrested than those who are housed. In part, here's why. According to a 2019 report by the National Homelessness Law Center, 92%, there was a 92% increase in citywide bans on camping in this country between 2006 and 2019. Meanwhile, citywide bans on sleeping in public increased by 50%, and on sitting and lying in public spaces by 78%, on loitering by 103%, and on living in vehicles by 213%. Homeless people are crazy. Here's the context. African Americans represent 13% of the general population, yet they make up more than 40% of the homeless population. Now, let's check this out. According to a 2019 Rutgers study, clinicians found a distinct tendency to, quote, overemphasize the relevance of psychotic symptoms and overlook symptoms of depression in African Americans. So when you put that into context, you see the thought constructs and the structures that are having us pathologize people who are unhoused, automatically pathologize. Homeless people are drug addicts. Okay, so a lot of unhoused people, like I mentioned in my opening, I saw a lot of people who were doing drugs. So if you are in hell, what are you going to do to cope with being in hell? What are you going to do with a 24/7 threat to your life? You're either going to fight, you're going to flee, or you're going to freeze. Part of that freezing or fleeing, which is like a disassociation, is the need to numb out to where you are. I had a lot of judgment about people who take drugs before I became unhoused. A lot of judgment. Then after going through that experience and coming out of it and looking back on it, reflecting on the pain entailed, I understand the need to numb out. My brain's way of numbing out was just to freeze and disassociate. Other people disassociate from that reality by taking drugs. And I hope that many of you by now have heard of Dr. Gabor Mate. He's a Canadian physician who has written several New York Times bestsellers, the most recent of which is The Myth of Normal, and before that, When the Body Says No. And in The Body Says No, he has a very increasingly famous quote where he says, the real question is not why the addiction. The real question is why the pain. So, and we're getting to the answer period, but I want to, end by saying ongoing trauma stressors can lead to an exhaustive list of symptoms, including depression, substance abuse, disassociation, health problems, and post-traumatic stress. And not only that, but researchers have found chronic inflammation, which is in turn the origin of many life-threatening conditions, including heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and rheumatoid arthritis, which explains why unhoused people are so much more likely to die than housed people. They die in their 50s. So they die like decades earlier than their housed counterparts. And neuroplasticity, I think we've kind of touched on it, but simply put, if we do not believe in the ability of a person to heal, and particularly of their brain to heal from trauma, then we will not invest in the trauma-aware services necessary for the mind and body to do so. My trauma-aware experience that quickly shifted things for me was when it was about 3 days after I left the park bench. I hadn't had a conversation in 2 years. And I went to a nonprofit, The Journey of Hope, and this woman named Shannon Miller Cox sat across from me. She had founded the organization. And instead of interrogating me or blaming me, re-traumatizing me, she just stated a fact. She said 99.9% of the women that she helped start new lives had been harmed in homelessness, and that harm almost always looked like sexual abuse. And when she said that, I remember this moment, I lifted my eyes up off the floor, looked her in her eyes, something I hadn't done in 2 years, and said, I was sexually assaulted in homelessness. And that was the beginning of my first conversation. And that was also the beginning of moving back into the world where I was able to see myself as human instead of like lesser than or somebody who wasn't worthy. So I know I've gone over my time, right? I could keep talking, but I'm going to open it up to question and answers at this point.
I just want to say at the outset, this was incredible, and thank you as well for your willingness to share your story. You mentioned the re-traumatizing aspect that this can have sometimes, and I just want to be aware of that. And thank you again for your willingness to share this and all the research and the experiences afterwards from coming out of homelessness as well.
Yeah, you're welcome. And the part that I didn't talk about was, as a journalist, like my refusal to re-traumatize the people I interview. So I just want to say that's really important to me, and I go to great lengths not to do so.
No, and we definitely have a lot of questions, and I'll give this purview to the chat. Is like, keep them coming. We'll go as long as we can.
I'm fine. Yeah, that's fine. I'm here. Yeah.
No, we appreciate the time. And I guess kind of one thing that to get started, I thought kind of ends on what you were just mentioning is how can we acknowledge the trauma in others and help provide support when we're realizing someone is disassociating or something? That was one of the questions we had from the chat.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah, so just when experiencing people with trauma, how do we build that support with that person to help either find resources to help them come to terms with their experiences? Just what's kind of some initial steps someone can take if they realize
Yeah.
they're in that situation?
So I think the one of the most important things that we can do in the presence of someone who is undergoing trauma is to drop our agenda of how we're going to help them. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because you might think, well, this person needs X, Y, and Z, and it's really clear to me. But I think at the core of its definition, trauma awareness is about giving the power back to the person. Because what is trauma about? It's about powerlessness. So you ask the person, instead of taking over, you actually say, what do you need? What do you want? Right? And then wait. And sometimes you may be surprised. It might be simply listening to them. It might be something you never expected, a Coke. I don't know what it's going to be, but allow space for them to tell you instead of you to foist that on them.
Yeah, listening, I think, and being present, like you mentioned, is so important. And kind of related to this as well is, have you seen instances of where journalism has resulted in the community to reduce this trauma and harm and kind of a bigger picture?
I think that for me, what I see are very traumatized people who have an inherent distrust of the press because of the historical legacy it has of misidentifying them or misrepresenting them, right? And in my trauma-aware approach, I think the biggest change is I see a willingness on the part of the person I'm interviewing to want to interact with me, to stay in an interaction with me, and therefore become a part of, see themselves as a part of the media instead of an us and a them. It's a collaborative effort. And that's very powerful because that's inclusion.
Yeah. Again, kind of related to that is we had a question about the importance of modeling the use of terms such as unsheltered and reframing the narrative and giving that power back to the person instead of kind of talking at it from a third person perspective. And are there other terms like unsheltered that we should be thinking about in these situations and that we could educate ourselves more on?
Well, I use the term unsheltered and unhoused because of the stereotypes that homelessness brings up. And so when you use the word unsheltered or unhoused, it stops the brain and it makes you say, oh, what are you saying? And why are you saying it that way? And it just opens up the space to say something different and something new. And so that's why I use a different term. And I do think it's really important.
Yeah, language has so much power. And I think this goes back to another question that was asked about how we can be more compassionate to the groups we label or dismiss as others. And I think that's right to your point, is kind of taking our step across from that stereotypes and looking at really what are we saying? What is the context behind that? But are there any other strategies or resources that people can use to try to reconcile with their othering of other people? I guess I don't know if that's the easiest way to say that.
Yeah. So the people that I really have learned a lot from include Dr. Gabor Mate, who I mentioned, Besser Vanderkalk, who I also mentioned, There's also Dr. Peter Levine. And they all have YouTube channels and, books that you can avail yourself of. And those are great and very eye-opening. And also, I think, at the foundation of this issue of othering is that we have a real issue in this country of acknowledging trauma, not only in others, but in ourselves. So if you're unable to recognize the trauma in your own life and come to terms with it, how are you going to do that for somebody else? Like, you can't give what you don't have. If you don't have compassion for your own self, you're not going to have compassion for somebody else. And it's a really big topic that I think was opened up by the pandemic, where we began tossing around these words, oh, I'm traumatized. This is really traumatizing, to be isolated and to go through this and to feel like a victim. And, so I think that it's a very opportune time to start to look at our own trauma.
Yeah. And again, that you had that quote of someone who said, without acknowledging trauma, we can't recognize the reaction to it. And so really kind of, again, that internal struggle of identifying that, to be able to, like you said, move past it and also help others with that as well.
Yeah. And not pathologizing it, right? Because trauma can be healed. Like, trauma is healable. Many people, including myself, are healing from trauma. And so I think at the same time you mentioned trauma, like I said, we need to mention neuroplasticity and the ability to heal from trauma. There are ways to regulate the nervous system. It's not something to fear. It's something to acknowledge.
Yeah. And I guess that goes to another question that we had is, do you feel like this work sometimes is re-traumatizing, or does it help you reconcile with that? And I know that's
Me
more
personally.
Yeah, that was
Yeah. So in the beginning, it was hard, right? But I've done a lot of work on myself to heal and to learn to regulate my own nervous system. And so, for example, I just went out to Los Angeles to spend time on Skid Row for a big project about trauma awareness and homelessness. Just a little plug here. If you want to read that story, you can go to my website, LoriYearwood.com. It's coming out February 12th. And I spent days on Skid Row, and I sat with a man who had huge abscess on his leg, and was unsheltered, and the room smelled, and it was very difficult. And no, it didn't bring me back to my own trauma, but it was traumatizing. And I think that if it wasn't, then I wouldn't have been in my own humanity, right? And the way that I deal with that is through deep self-care, right? Like, I'm really careful to take very good care of myself on mentally, physically, spiritually, economically. I have all these things in place, and I work hard at it to do the job I do, recognizing that it's really challenging.
Yeah. And I will share that link to your website right there for the chat for people.
Thank you.
No problem. And someone else, a friend, I believe, Jim Schlee, and I apologize for pronouncing that name, was mentioning the work you do with the Economic Hardship Organization. And could you just maybe talk a little bit about that for us to close out?
Sure. So I am a housing crisis reporter at the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which supports journalists in writing about these individuals and communities who are so historically marginalized and currently marginalized. And they support our work in such a way that it makes it possible for us to live and thrive as journalists, which is something that has become increasingly difficult in this world to do. And they co-publish our stories. So with national news organizations. So that's how I am supported in writing for places like the Washington Post or the New York Times, which may take like a month or 2 months to produce a story and a paycheck. I'm supported in that process by the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. And you can go to their website at the Economic Hardship Reporting Project and see some really good work by many amazing journalists, all writing about economic hardship.
No, thank you for sharing that resource. I'll definitely follow up, because I know one of the things about this presentation and many others is I have a lot of research and learning to continue to do on this topic. And so I just want to say thank you again, Lori, for taking the time today to speak with us on this important topic, and for giving us a lot of information that we can bring back to our communities and continue learning and supporting others. And so thank you again for this event.
You are so welcome. I don't know, for me, the time flew by. I hope for you too. So thank you very much.
I know, an hour always feels too short.
Yeah, it's like, woo. Yeah.